Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So usually I talk about entertainment or the entertainment systems, at the very least something tangential towards entertainment, but today I'm going to talk about argumentation, and I really think it's time for me to do so because it's also time to go on the offensive against these quote unquote progressive people that have destroyed our entertainment and so many other things. But before I get there, I just want to let everyone know that the link is in the description for my two superhero graphic novels. They are 84-page spectaculars of epic superhero excitement, adventure, and fun. The campaign where you can get both of those graphic novels is on Indiegogo, but it has been shadow banned, so you have to have the link, which again is in the description, to go directly there if you want to see if my graphic novels are for you. Also, there is a link in the description for my upcoming fantasy graphic novel, CROM the Destroyer. This is an homage to Conan, but not really Conan directly, more the Celtic myth that inspired the character of Conan itself. And you're looking at some of the spectacular art from all of my graphic novels in the background. So again, if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on those links in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novels are for you. Now, back to the reason why I want to talk specifically about argumentation today. Again, it's because we've been fighting against these people who have destroyed our entertainment and so many other things for so long. We've been fighting against them for quite some time now, and we seem to be gaining a little bit of ground. They're on their back foot. They're on the defensive for the first time in a long time. But here's the thing. These people know very well how to manipulate an audience in order to get their way. And they know that the best defense is a good offense. And that's what they're doing. They're going on the offensive to shore up the shortcomings of being on the defensive. And I'm here to say, don't let that put you on the defensive. You go straight ahead and continue to be on the offensive. That is what is needed. Now, why did I come to that conclusion? Well, I've been listening to the Talking Heads for the last couple of weeks, and I've heard this interesting turn of phrase come out of a number of them, and I think it's going to start to trickle down towards people who control entertainment or other industries, and you're probably going to hear the same line from your quote-unquote progressive family members, let's say maybe by the 4th of July, probably by Thanksgiving. It's let's be reasonable. But here's the thing. This is a very simple tactic that the quote-unquote progressive side uses to win an argument without themselves having to be rational, because the progressive ideology is not based on rationality. It's based upon power and control. You can go to their own literature describing what their ideology is about, and it will say that right out. Let me, as I usually do, flash up that Smithsonian article that came out several years ago now, saying that cause and effect thinking is actually part of the supremacy of one light-skinned kind of people. Why? Because this is a quote-unquote progressive statement, and cause and effect thinking is rationality. But again, here's the thing. Why these people would say, let's be rational, when they're trying to argue from a defensive position. It's not because they actually want to be rational. It's not because they're going to be rational in some kind of argumentation or even conversation. It's not that their ideology is rational in any way. It's a simple way to move their audience rather than their opponent. And that's what they're trying to do by saying, let's be rational. Or the more lightly way that you will hear it is, let's be reasonable. These people are not being reasonable. So the point is that if they say something like, let's be reasonable, and then you start hammering home your point in a reasonable way, in a rational way, that will simply make you appear like you're not being rational to the people who are the audience, because most people seriously don't understand what rationality is. It will appear that the people on the quote-unquote progressive side have extended an olive branch by saying, let's be reasonable. You slapped it away by putting down facts in front of them, and therefore the people in the audience will look at you and say, I really don't have to consider what you have to say, because obviously, in their minds, you're not being reasonable. So, in effect, these quote unquote progressive people win a rational argument, so called, by saying, let's be reasonable. And they do that in order to generate sympathy, not reason, from the people listening to vilify you in a very subtle way so that the audience does not listen to what you have to say. And if they don't, then you lose. But there's a very easy way to flip this over on them. Well, first of all, right now you hear this, let's be reasonable, from the talking heads on the television who don't have anyone opposing them. Therefore, they just put up a straw man, which they then knock down, saying the other side is not being reasonable, therefore we're right, therefore don't listen to what they have to say. But again, this is going to trickle down to people who you can actually speak to, who you can actually interact with. And then, when that comes about, you need to actually be rational, but in a very specific way. Keep your eye on the ball if you want to win this argument, and keep on the offensive so that these people do not use this as an opportunity to once again gain ground. So, you do this by flipping it on them, by saying right at the beginning, yes, you're absolutely right. Agree with them 100%. Say, you're absolutely right. I think we should be reasonable. Then it will appear to the audience, whether they're your relatives sitting around your Thanksgiving table, or the other people in your class, or the other people who you work with, they will see that on your part as accepting that olive branch, and they will be much more readily available to listen to what you have to say. But when that happens, you ensure that you keep your eye on the prize and you actually be rational. And not just rational, but very, very simplistically rational. Ask very simple questions. Again, you ask questions, and then you won't appear to be on the offensive, but ask questions about very simplistic things, which will lead to a rational outcome. And then the other side, who is not rational, will lose this argument. And again, when I say lose, I don't mean you will convince this other quote unquote progressive person that what they're saying is wrong. That's highly unlikely. But you will, if you do it correctly, convince the people around you that, yeah, you have something actually worthwhile to listen to when you open your mouth and speak. Now, how do you do this? Well, in order to do this, I want to go very deep into the rabbit hole of what reason actually is. Hopefully, this won't be boring to many people. Hopefully, you can power through it if you don't want to specifically hear the ins and outs of this entire thing, but it does lead into how you can continue to be on the offensive. And really, the reason why I want to talk about this is because I'm always talking about reason and logic. I'm always talking about the nature of things. That is to say, human nature, the nature of a hero, the nature of a good story. I'm always going on about these kinds of terms. It's about time that I gave a short but in-depth look at why I'm always going back to these. And it feeds right into what I want to talk about today, about keeping on the offensive. However, that all being said, what I'm about to say for the next couple of minutes is a very, very simplified form of this entire thing. Entire books have been written about each of the sentences that I'm about to say. So, if you want to know about being reasonable, well, let's look at rationality itself. First of all, let's look at the extent of rationality when you apply the rules of reason to reason itself. That's called logic. And what is the real definition of logic? Well, logic is defined as the art which directs the very acts of reason and enables man to advance with order, ease, and correctness in the act of reason itself. So that's a big old long way of saying, as I said, it is taking the rules of reason and applying them to reason itself to ensure that when you reason, you do so with order, ease, and correctness. Now, logic is known as an operation of the intellect. But in order to get to logic itself, it is preceded by another intellectual operation. And that operation of the mind that precedes logic is, of course, reason. And what is the definition of the intellectual operation of reason itself? Well, it's an understanding that we, as human beings, do not come to knowledge all at once. We come to it through a step-by-step process. And that step-by-step process is to take knowledge of known truths and proceed from that knowledge of known truths into knowledge of unknown truths. That is to say, you put together all of the things that you know are true, and then you get to understand something that you didn't previously know to be true. This is the act of reason itself. But again, here's the thing. Reason as an intellectual operation is based upon a prior intellectual operation called judgment. Judgment is basically defined as the intellectual operation that allows you to take one of those known truths and to say, yes, this is true. Whereas reasoning takes a bunch of what is usually termed as enunciations or propositions and say we're going to combine them all together because we know that they're true. Judgment says, I'm going to take this particular enunciation or proposition and see if it is true. So it's to concentrate on the one instead of the many. Or to put it another way, you're using simple propositions like A is B. And how do you know that? Well, because the definition of A is included in B. Or that is to say, those two things are in actuality the same. It's just simply within our way of understanding that we break them down into different intellectual objects. But in essence, they are the same. And by the way, you can also do it in a negative sense, saying A is not C. We know this because the essence of A is not contained within C, nor is A the same as C in its essential being. But again, the intellectual operation of judgment is preceded by another intellectual operation, which is known as simple apprehension. Now, I've talked about this many times before, and I have said simple apprehension is basically defining a thing as it exists within reality. It's basically breaking that enunciation or proposition down into the terms that it comes from that make it up and understanding exactly what each term means in reality. Now, definition is a bit of a loose term. Why? Because a definition is not exactly simple apprehension. Why? Well, because definitions, well, there's several different ways you can express a definition. Again, entire books have been written on this. First of all, there's what's known as a nominal definition and a real definition. What is a nominal definition? Well, it's basically the common understanding of everybody of how this thing is defined. It can be, let's say, what people on the street would define this word as. That's a nominal definition. But there is a more accurate kind of definition. It's called a real definition. And even real definitions in themselves are not exactly simple apprehension. Why? Because you can define a real definition by simply giving something that is its like and something that is not like onto it. So a perfectly fine real definition is A is B, but A is not C. But again, since you're doing that, that presupposes judgment, so it's not simple apprehension itself. But here's the thing. If you have a good nominal definition, it can lead you back to a good real definition. If you have a good real definition, it can lead you back to simple apprehension. So briefly, and I'm almost done with this part, briefly, let's look at the definition of simple apprehension itself. Simple apprehension is defined as the operation by which the intellect perceives the quiddity or essence of a thing without affirming or denying anything about it. Now, why can't you affirm or deny anything about it? Because that would be judgment. So you're looking for the essence of the thing, the quiddity of the thing. And you can do this in several different ways. You can say, what is essential to it? That is to say, what does this thing possess that is possessed by every one of the like of it in all cases? Every last case. Therefore, you're looking at the essence of the thing. Or you could look at what is the cause of this thing. This thing is an effect. What is its cause, etc., etc. So you're looking at basically the nature of what a thing is. And when you look at the nature of what a thing is, you look at it objectively, not subjectively. And again, what's the difference between those two things? Well, again, I'll give you the nominal definition of subjective and objective. Subjective means it is true because you know it, like it, or believe it. Objectively true things exist as true no matter whether you know it, like it, or believe it. Therefore, the statement, I like chocolate ice cream, is subjective. Why? Because you break it down into subject and predicate. I am the subject. The predicate is like chocolate ice cream. Like chocolate ice cream is dependent upon what? It's dependent upon the subject, I. But if you look at an objective definition, it is the object which defines itself. This thing is not defined by the subject, by someone saying, I know it, I like it, I believe it, therefore it is X. No, it's defined by the being of this thing is what it is. Now, why have I gone so far into the weeds with this entire thing? Well, first off, it's to give you some reference to language so you can go and look this up yourself if you want to and actually understand what it means instead of my poor definition, which I'm sure people will point out is wrong here, here, and here. Why? Because I'm doing a YouTube video. You need to go look it up and you'll see exactly what it is. There's literature on this for the last 2,000 years, actually 2,400 years. But the other reason being, well, it's simply to show the fact that in order to have logic, first, you must climb up the steps to reason. In order to get to reason, you have to climb up the steps to judgment. In order to climb up the steps to judgment, you have to climb up the steps to simple apprehension. If you wish to get to simple apprehension, you need to, at the very bare minimum, be able to define what a thing is. And when you define what a thing is, you're putting the limits on this thing, saying it is like this, but not like that. Then, if you have a good definition, even if it's a nominal definition, as I said, it can lead into a real definition, which can lead into simple apprehension, which will then allow you to move on to the next step of judgment, and then to reason, and then to logic. And all of that is necessary for being reasonable. If you want to use reason, if you want to use rationality, you need to have those other steps. It will not work if you skip any of those steps. But these quote-unquote progressive people cannot define simple things. And since they cannot define simple things, then they cannot proceed to simple apprehension, and therefore they are not being rational. Therefore, the easiest way to do this, to argue with this person after you say, oh, you want to be reasonable. That's a good idea. Let's do that 100%. Let's be rational. Then you say, what is the definition of this? Why? Well, of course, because I need to understand what you mean by the things that you're saying. If you're saying these things to me and I need to understand them, you need to define them for me. Please define them for me so that I can reasonably understand. Now, I want to pause there and go back very slightly and talk about the fact that, you see, the reason why the left is so good at argumentation is because they've destroyed our ability to define things and therefore get to simple apprehension. This ensures that any opponent that they face is basically neutered because they can't understand rationally how to argue. And again, they've done this by control and destruction of language for the last at least 100 years, probably a couple of hundred by this point. And this controlled destruction is destruction, little by little, of all the things that I just talked about. Right now, we're at the stage where they say, well, you see, everybody can define things for themselves, so you really can't get to the definition of anything. It's all subjective. And if you can't do that, you can't get to simple apprehension, therefore you can't be rational. Or previously they would have said, well, let's just go with the nominal definition of what the thing is. And since they would confuse subjects by using simply a nominal definition, which can change and be subject to the fallacy of equivocation, which is changing the definition of something halfway through your argument, then they can destroy the ability to lead back to simple apprehension, which destroys the ability to reason. Or before that, they would have said, well, look, you see, the accidents of this thing, those things that are non-essential to what it is, are actually part of what make up how we're going to define it. Instead of actually looking at the essence of the thing, the essential nature of it, we're going to define it by its accidents, again, which destroys your ability to lead back to simple apprehension, which destroys reason. And why I wanted to say that is we're in a unique position right now. Why? Because these people are going backwards to their old arguments and trying to rehash those old arguments that they used in times past. Arguments like, well, let's be reasonable about this. This is what they used to say. I would say in the 80s and 90s, you would get these quote unquote progressive people, and they would say, let's be reasonable. Let's talk about this in a reasonable way. And then they would use this equivocation. They would use this sophistry. They would use this mixing up of things that don't actually lead to anything real in order to confuse the subject, in order to ensure that you don't win the argument. And their trump card was their opponent would be rational and say, well, you see, if I'm being completely rational and logical about this, your actions are going to lead to X, Y, and Z. And they would say, oh, that will never happen. That's just a slippery slope argument. That is never going to be part of what we are going to do in the future. But right now, we can see all of that happening. And they can't go back to that argument for the moment. You see, they will, if given time, if we allow them breathing space, they will have that breathing space to say, okay, we're going to disavow all of these things and say, well, that wasn't really us, or that wasn't really what we were trying to say. But you can't do that right now. If they take a step back and try to say, oh, no, it's not going to lead to that, you just got to point to something down the street and say, oh, yeah, look at this. And the third thing I want to say about this before moving on is, yes, I realize this is all happening right now because of movement started by people like, I think, Matt Walsh. And I don't know specifically a whole lot about Matt Walsh. Yes, I have seen some of his videos, but I don't follow him so much so that I watch everything he does, not by a long shot. So I don't know everything that's going on there. But he has hit upon this exact thing that needs to be done. He's saying, define for me what a woman is. And these people are losing their heads. These people cannot deal with this question because they can't define it. And that's what's leading them to say things like, well, you're not being reasonable. Well, that's where you grasp upon this whole idea that let's be reasonable. Sure, please define for me what this is. That's a reasonable request, is it not? That you define what you're talking about so I can understand what you're talking about. And if you can't give me a definition of it, then you're not being very reasonable. And here's the thing, if you get in some kind of argument like this, don't get bogged down in the weeds. The problem that most people make, most conservative people make when trying to argue with these quote-unquote progressive people is they get bogged down in the weeds. And they allow these quote-unquote progressive people to throw out a red herring of one very specific example or a group of examples and then lead you down that path. Don't do that. Why? Because an argument is divided into matter and form. Matter is what constitutes the subject that you're dealing with, that you're talking about, but the form of the argument itself is whether or not it's following the rules of reason. It's whether or not it's an actual rational argument. But if you have a corrupted form, you're not going to come to any conclusion whatsoever within your discussion. Nothing that's going to have any impact within what is real, within reality, and so they win. And the quote-unquote progressive people are masters at doing this, throwing out red herrings within the matter so that you don't look and see that the form upon which you are proceeding with this entire conversation or argument is corrupted. But if you concentrate on simple things like, please define for me what this is, it is a reasonable request that I can understand what you're trying to say by having you define it. Then you're concentrating. Even though you're asking for matter, you're concentrating on the form of the argument. And you're saying, well, you see, if you can't do that simple thing, then the form of the argument is not rational. Therefore, you're not being reasonable. And again, that entire thing can be summed up in, please define for me what this thing is. That's a reasonable request. Can you not grant that reasonable request? And again, when they cannot give you a definition of this thing, it shows that they're not being reasonable. And then the shoe is on the other foot. Then the people in the audience are looking around at them going, you said you wanted to be reasonable, but you don't seem to actually want to stick to that. And if your progressive opponent does try to pull out a so-called definition by saying, well, you see, every individual has their own definition of this thing, or it's defined in so many ways that I can't give you a specific definition of it, then all you got to say is, well, look, there's 7 billion people on the planet. I can't tell what you think, feel, believe, nor can I tell what the other 7 billion people on this planet think, feel, or believe. How am I supposed to reasonably deal with you and with them and everyone around me if I can't understand how simple things are defined? Because if you define it one way and the person next to you defines it the exact opposite way, I can't agree with one of you without offending the other one and asking me to automatically know what you're thinking or feeling and therefore define this thing as is not a rational or reasonable request of you. And again, stay on target. Don't get distracted. Don't fall for red herrings. Don't go into the matter when they can't actually define anything and therefore proving that they can't actually be rational or have a rational discussion. Why? Well, because number one, if these people, after asking you to be reasonable, start screaming and yelling because they can't get out of it any other way, you've obviously, in the eyes of the people around you, won that argument. Number two, because this has been their high ground for such a long time now. Their high ground is, well, you see, I'm being reasonable. You see, I'm being compassionate. This is their two pinnacles of high ground from which they tried to convince the audience around them that, yes, they're on the right side of history. But if you knock them off their high horse and show that no, they're not being reasonable at all by simply asking simple questions, then they'll move on to, well, you see, we're doing this for compassion. We're doing this out of feeling. And you can deal with that very easily by saying, okay, again, agree with them and say, okay, let's be compassionate. Let's do this according to a compassionate way. But you can also be compassionate and reasonable at the same time. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. I want to be compassionate and reasonable all at the same time. Because again, if I'm just compassionate to everyone and you define a thing the exact opposite the way that the guy next to you defines a thing, I'm trying to be compassionate to both of you at the same time. If I agree with one of you, then I'm not being compassionate. I'm being the opposite of compassionate to the person next to you. Therefore, let's be reasonable in our compassion and say, well, let's define things according to how we can all understand them. Now, that's a separate argument, the whole compassion thing. But the point being is that if you knock these people down off of their high horse of reasonable and then compassionate, either or both at the same time, then the mask comes off. And the mask comes off and shows that their ideology is not built upon anything but power. This is simply, again, from their own literature, the way that this entire ideology is built is power accumulation. It is power politics. It is power components, one person having power over another. And you need to show those around you that no, they're not being rational. No, they're not being compassionate. Yes, it's all about power. They will start to freely admit that when they start to lose an argument. And I don't know where you live in the world, but I do know that if you're in America, it's a really, really easy jump from all you're basing everything on is power to, yeah, that kind of thinking is wrong. Why? Because that's the entire reason why the country was built to begin with. This is the reason for the founding documents. And I would probably say, don't go into the whole, this is the American country, because then they'll start with the whole slavery and the whole built on slavery thing. Just say something like, you see, isn't that what the Declaration of Independence is all about? It's to say that those people over there can't have arbitrary power over everybody at their whim. Every individual should have their own right. This is a great argument and example. Why? Because the Declaration of Independence and the entire reason why these founding documents exist is because they proceed upon natural law, which is a rational way of describing man and their existence and how they create societies. But that is the very simple way of doing it. It's to say, well, look, all you're doing is saying that you don't want to define anything. You don't want to be reasonable. All you want to be is compassionate. But that compassion is to say to everyone, they have to do what you say that they have to do. That is just tyranny. Isn't that the entire reason why this country was created to begin with? Isn't this the entire reason for the Declaration of Independence? To say, hey, you over there, you can't arbitrarily tell me just because you have power what I have to do. And then the audience is yours. So is it really that easy? Is it really that simple? Is it going to work all the time? Well, no, it's argumentation. Argumentation is a slippery thing even when you get it right. And these people, these quote unquote progressive people, they're the slipperiest creatures you're ever going to come across. But at the same time, The point is stay on the offensive. And if you can stay on the offensive and at the same time appear reasonable because you are being reasonable, then they continue to lose ground. And the more the quote unquote progressive side loses ground, the more and more their mask will slip. The more and more they will retreat into power and saying, I have power, therefore I get to tell you what to do. This is what normal people need to see. And this is what has been presented to us for the taking right now, so that we can show it to other people. Because it doesn't matter how much power these progressive people accumulate, it doesn't matter how much power they can bring to bear on you, they can never defeat you if you're being reasonable, if you're using rationality. Why? Because if you're being rational, then reality is on your side. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, the links are in the description for my 2 superhero graphic novels and my upcoming fantasy graphic novel. So if you're interested in comics or graphic novels, click on those links in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novels are for you. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.